who I'll introduce briefly. We'll have a little conversation among us, and then we'll have some time for questions from those in the room and those participating online, where I think you can just type in your questions at any time into the Zoom function. So to my immediate right is Colleen Krenwellige, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the Department of State. Further to the right is Don Chisholm, the Director of the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And then on my left is David Mandel Anthony, the Deputy to the Ambassador in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the U.S. Department of State. So as we've said, we're talking about the latest report that's based on the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which came into force now 4.5 years ago. So to get us started, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what progress you would point to in the U.S. government's process and output and impact on helping prevent mass atrocities since that law went into place. What are the bright spots you see, and what are the remaining core challenges? Colleen, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for joining. It really is great to be here. Thanks very much for moderating, and thanks for hosting us today. Improving process always is a process, but we have made some progress, I would say, over the last several years. Our Atrocity Prevention Task Force meets regularly now at the working level. Every other week, in fact. So this is a White House-led body that includes agencies across the U.S. government, State Department, Treasury, USAID, you name it, really. The agency is part of the White House-led Atrocity Prevention Task Force. And as the report notes, we've increased our focus over the last year, in particular, on atrocity prevention. And that's always the most difficult part of what we do, preventing atrocities before they occur. But we have tried to increase our focus on that. And one of the things we've done is release an updated U.S. Atrocity Risk Assessment Framework. That's publicly available, it's online. And we've used that framework in priority prevention countries identified by the US government writ large to conduct in-country assessments of atrocity risks based on things like upcoming elections, for example. And we've taken what we've discovered in those visits to try to identify concrete recommendations for policy and action that we can take in those countries to prevent atrocities. So those have been some bright spots, updating that assessment framework, publishing it, and then using it as a lens through which we can identify possible actions. We're right now focused on implementing those recommendations. So again, huge bright spots. But and we'll continue to work on trying to improve process. That's always a work in progress. But obviously, it remains really, really difficult to prevent atrocities, as we've seen in Ukraine and Sudan. But we're working through that Atrocity Prevention Task Force, even to address ongoing atrocities like what we're seeing in Ukraine and Sudan.
Great. Don, you want to add on that, or David, on the basic question of kind of progress and challenges as you see them?
Sure, I can just speak a little bit. I mean, first, thanks to everyone for assembling today. It's a community of practice that requires different stakeholders in order to make any progress. And so we view our partnership with NGOs and civil society as really an essential component of advancing the agenda of atrocity prevention. I would just say that I've been working on various iterations of this policy commitment for over a decade now for the State Department, starting with the creation of the Atrocity Prevention Board. And one of the chief benefits I see of the Elie Wiesel Act has been the fact that it's anchored this initiative into legislation. And that's just incredibly important for a variety of reasons. First of all, because it signals how important this issue is to Congress as a bipartisan matter, and invests Congress and our political leaders in this agenda as well. And then secondly, because those of you who know how it is to work inside large bureaucratic institutions and organizations understand how important it is that there be a kind of an anchor structuring the policy commitments that are made, And that helps us build that out across administrations and with a degree of continuity. That's all that suggests. So it is a work in progress. The Elie Wiesel Act has been a really important milestone in what has been a long development of this policy priority for the U.S. government, and really a way that helps codify our commitments and ensure regular sort of time-bound reports and deliverables and actions.
Sure, Lawrence. And also I want to start off by just thanking AFP for hosting and for you moderating. It's great to be on the panel with my colleagues from state. I'd just like to underscore something that Colleen said about the bright spots. I think it's challenging for us within a single bureaucracy with multiple offices to work on atrocity prevention. So it's even more challenging when we move into the interagency. One thing I've been really impressed with is the fact that this is truly an interagency effort. Before, what you may have seen in the space, you may have seen a part of one agency or even one agency trying to define, trying to analyze the context and trying to come up with recommendations that are really limited to that agency's toolbox. And what we've seen over the past years, we've come together, state and AID and other agencies as well. And what happens is when you bring in the variety of specialists that each agency within this working group has, you are getting a breadth of recommendations that we by ourselves wouldn't have been able to come up with. And so we in AID are generally looking at the upstream objectives and what we can do in the development space. But when you bring in these other agencies who come in with other with different expertise, whether it's sanctions, whether it's the analytical capacity of CSO, whether it's the Global Women's Initiative. I mean, there are different experts that can come in, and it gives much more nuance to our recommendations and puts us in really a much better place as the USG. I think that's a great bright spot to highlight.
Great. Maybe I could pick up on one of the things you said, Colleen, about your intention to prioritize prevention. I think, there's always within entities that are have the mandate to help prevent and respond to mass atrocities, a tug towards the response side. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how exactly you're going about that prioritizing of prevention, and a little bit more about what that looks like in practice. I think the report, a number of people commented, is heavier in describing some of the response efforts. So to the extent you're able to give us a little bit more color on what is prevention looking like in practice, as well as how you're going about putting it front and center.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, we have tried in a very concerted way over the last year in particular to focus more and more on prevention. And one of the things one concrete thing we did was to identify a certain number of countries as priority prevention countries, looking around the globe and assessing where atrocities were most likely to occur. Initially, at the very start of this process, we came up with a relatively long list of countries, right? Data of one sort or another pointed to the potential likelihood of atrocities in those countries. We narrowed that list down to a smaller, more manageable number, and then conducted trips to those countries. And it was an interagency effort, USAID, state, other agencies, conducted consultations with local communities, with civil society, with government, with a range of partners on the ground in those countries, to really get a sense of the local context and to get a better in-person sense of the likelihood of atrocities occurring. And then we took those consultations and produced a series of recommendations for each of those countries, things that could be done, and everything from programming that USAID potentially could implement or that state could implement, to, for example, train journalists to call attention to signs of potential atrocities. And we've, explored options in the future. Should atrocities occur, we've looked at what we potentially could do. Sometimes messaging in advance is really, really helpful in terms of indicating behind closed doors often to government officials that, if we start seeing signs of atrocities, we could potentially do things like impose visa-related restrictions on travel to the United States, or impose sanctions on individuals. Sometimes just the threat of those things really goes a long way in terms of preventing atrocities. I would say we've seen a little bit of that in Bangladesh. in terms of, earlier this year, we announced a visa restriction policy on that would enable us to impose travel-related restrictions on any official that was seen to be undermining the democratic process, undermining the elections that the country is expected to hold later this year. And we've seen in the past where elections in Bangladesh are concerned that often there is violence. So we're taking action even now to try to prevent that same thing from occurring. So again, identifying some priority countries, conducting assessments in those countries, and then collectively as part of the interagency process coming up with recommendations for action, and then actually trying to implement those actions.
Could I just pick up on that last
Sure,
point?
yeah.
So the recommendations are out of these assessments are
Yeah.
to whom, and then what is the role of the task force in following through on
Sure.
trying to get them adopted and implemented and then monitoring
Yeah.
beyond that?
The recommendations are agreed across the U.S. government in coordination with the Atrocity Prevention Task Force. That acts really as the convening body, starting at the working level to come up with ideas and suggestions, and then passing those recommendations up through the U.S. government decision-making chain. And then it becomes the responsibility of the interagency, again coordinated by the task force, to implement those recommendations. And we do that in close coordination with our folks on the ground, with our embassies overseas. Yeah.
Great. Don, do you want to pick up on the prevention part, given that, as you say, USAID's general focus tends to be on things that can be done well in advance? Particularly, I wonder, what kind of receptivity are you finding from your counterparts in the field missions, in the regional bureaus, when this specialized group comes up with ideas to help reduce risks of atrocities?
I mean, there is very good receptivity. I mean, because it goes to the structural issues and the structural dysfunctionalities that these countries have. And so typically a mission will be focusing on those issues as part of its strategic approach. So you're looking at, for instance, rule of law, you're looking at governance issues, you're looking at reconciliation between communities. And these are structural issues where the mission probably is already to some extent in that space. And I think what the AP lens brings on it is a little bit more intentionality. I mean, it allows us to look at those structural issues and add AP focused indicators to make sure that there's a greater nexus between the structural issues that the mission is trying to address and the issue of prevention of atrocities.
Great. Also wanted to ask about the strategy, the first ever U.S. strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocities, which I think folks know came out about just over a year ago. I think that was great to see. Many of us in this community were really excited by what we saw on paper, and would love to hear more about now, how is that actually working in practice? How is having that strategy and that series of commitments affecting the process, the decision-making, the learning, the accountability, and so forth? David, do you want to chip in on that, having seen many of these different processes over the years?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very helpful to have a strategy document that brings together many of the practices that have already been developed and been put in place. It sort of sets down a framework. It sets down a template, and it allows sort of the specialists to engage with their colleagues across different bureaus and agencies. And I think it also sets out very clearly the common purpose that we have in this policy area. I think one element of that strategy also is how public it is, and how we are in fact committing to sort of certain actions and implementation. I will turn it over to my colleagues for further. I will just note that some counterparts from other governments have really taken note of this strategy as something that could possibly be useful for them to emulate within their own policymaking process. They view it as a very useful way to sort of cohere varied approaches across different agencies. And so we have conversations, ongoing dialogues with our counterparts. And so this is a sort of practice that is a useful copycat in a world where we know authoritarians often copycat repressive laws or other practices. We also can sort of do our own copycatting and learn from each other.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I mean, as you said, like the Elie Wiesel Act, the strategy serves as an anchor for our efforts across the US government. And it's nice to have that anchor to guide us towards some common goals. It gives us a common purpose, as you said. And it does provide a framework or a guide, through which we across the interagency with different areas of expertise and experience can come together toward some common goal and work together to apply lessons we've learned from the past to evolving situations. It also holds us accountable, given that it's so public, as you said. It requires us to look critically at what we have done in a given period, say a year, since that's the period we use for the report, and then say to the public and to Congress what we have done and maybe where we've fallen a bit short, and then it gives us a basis on which we can ground our efforts to improve in the future. So I think the strategy has been a hugely valuable tool.
One of the themes that's quite strong in the strategy is a commitment to learning and adapting. Wonder if anybody would want to give an illustration about how you've actually tried to do that. Is it through, after action processes or lessons learned reports specifically, or other ways to incorporate that into your regular practice?
I would point to the Atrocity Risk Assessment Framework as just one example. I mean, that has gone through at least 2 iterations, right? We published an updated version last fall. So we have shown ourselves, maybe not especially quickly at times, but we have shown ourselves to be capable of looking at existing tools and adjusting them, modifying them. One of the things we did when we published this revised assessment framework was to incorporate much more emphasis on gender and its role in projecting risk of atrocities, its role in atrocities themselves, because we know, for example, that women and girls suffer more than others in conflict, and marginalized groups generally. So we have been able to adjust that tool. We've developed additional training, for example, to help government colleagues in Washington and overseas learn how to identify signs of potential atrocities, and that's been helpful. And we've adjusted that training as we've implemented it in various places and have received feedback from folks. So I think we have, those are just small examples, but I think they're reflective of a larger ability to take lessons learned and to try to apply them going forward. And we do have after action reports, and when we've conducted these in-country assessments over the last many months, we've looked very carefully afterward at what worked and what didn't, so that we can improve future assessments.
Can you give an example
Of what worked and what didn't? Well, sure. I mean, there has been very much an emphasis on partnering at the local level, right? We're placing an increasing emphasis on that. And we learned through some of those conversations in early assessments that we needed to take a more trauma-informed approach when we interact with survivors of violence and atrocities. So we've adjusted our approach, we adjusted our approach in subsequent assessments to make sure that that we paid a little more attention to things like that. Yeah.
If I can also add on to that, just 2 elements here as well. We used to have independent training. State had its AP training, AID had its training as well. Now we have gone through the process that a joint training and joint platform is much
Imagine
more
that.
effective.
Imagine,
And just I think looking at the process by which we have gone to these countries and done the interagency assessment, if you look over the course of time, the deeper we've gone into these assessments, the more countries have gone through, they're becoming faster, they're becoming far more quicker from soup to nuts in terms of getting recommendations in front of the decision makers.
I would add 2 points. One on the learning that has taken place around the way we design and hold these trainings is that it's been incredibly valuable to include locally employed staff at our embassies. Often a very underappreciated source of rich knowledge of the context, the history, the politics. And when the task at hand is to really identify indicators of mass atrocities, obviously that is so context specific. It often has to do with understanding the use of coded rhetoric or language that could be precursors of hate speech. And that's just one kind of example of how you put a little bit more solidity to atrocity risk indicators. So that's been tremendously helpful to have those. I mean, again, I may be dating myself by thinking back to how we first started with these trainings, but they really have become very, very comprehensive, very specific, and they arm our foreign service officers with actionable tools they can use in their day-to-day work at the embassy that actually they can report back to Washington. And so there's an ongoing sort of dialogue about risk indicators. And that's what the whole development of this assessment has been like.
Yeah.
I would say also that there's a kind of sophistication that has been developed in the indicators themselves. I took place in the first mission of the Atrocity Prevention Board to a country, to Burundi, where we were kind of making it up as to what the indicators should look like, and trying to leave that embassy with a template they could use to enhance their reporting going forward. And from that point to now is really quite a significant advancement in how, and in part that has been because the field, as I started by saying, the field of broader professionals and organizations working on this have also been developing and enhancing atrocity risk indicator frameworks. And it's sort of the collation of all of those efforts that help put it together.
Maybe I could ask kind of the flip side of Liz's question is, or what have you learned that you feel like we still need to learn a lot more about? What is emerging, whether it's new or whether it's a perennial challenge, but alongside all of this progress you've been describing, surely there are things you're feeling like if only we knew more about this problem or how to tackle that problem, we would be able to make much more progress.
Well, as David was saying, identifying appropriate risk indicators is always a challenge, and it's a work in progress. And it's not, part of the problem is that it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And David was saying too, so much, and when what Don was saying, so much of what we see is context specific, and risk indicators will vary based on the country and based on the population in that country's history and what we've seen in the past. So that is an ongoing struggle, I think, and certainly we can do a lot to improve there. And then identifying prevention tools, as we work collectively to focus more on prevention, because it's ideally what we'll be able to do. It sometimes is difficult. I think we all struggle to identify tools that actually will work. And it's also hard to prove causality, right? To prove that any action we took in any country ultimately prevented an atrocity. So we struggle with those challenges.
Yeah, I think it's one of the challenges that we have in EID is there are a lot of Washington-based priorities. And I think the missions are trying to implement the program, design the program, and then monitor and evaluate the program. And this is an important priority. And sometimes when you're caught with the op-tempo of the missions, it's hard to get this embedded into the mission. I think that's a constant struggle. I think it takes time. I think it takes the continual beating of the drum from Washington. I think it takes strong leadership at the mission level to really be able to position this within the op-tempo and the routine work of our folks in the missions. I think that will be a continual struggle, and I think there will be an ebb and flow to it. But I think what we've seen is that there is a desire, once the full breadth of what we're trying to do is understood, there is a desire to incorporate this and to have that lens on the programming. The question is how much time and how much bandwidth is available to do that.
I'd say a few things. First is the perhaps unsolvable challenge of balancing urgent crisis response with devoting resources, time, and attention and bandwidth to to more upstream early warning prevention. This is just going to be an enduring tension in the work of any government, any civil society organization that's taking a look. And then second, is even within that, learning how to prioritize given the frayed state of the world that we live in and the alarming number of countries and societies that are rightfully classified as facing some significant degree of risk of atrocities. Acting globally is, of course, what governments like the United States do, but it is always a question of prioritizing actions according to urgency, according to needs, according to potential impacts, and the best use of all of our time. And then third, I would just say is the issue of how to collectivize action at the multilateral level, especially in situations far upstream. The international community very often can swing into action quickly to respond to an urgent crisis or active violence that is quite widespread, but less inclined to expend the political capital, will, and attention to address countries that are far upstream. And it's not going to, it's not going to lead to an emergency session of the Human Rights Council, for example. So what are the ways that we can work with other partner governments to collectivize action far upstream? And I think part of that has also been a fairly significant advancement that the US government has been able to lead and participate in, is developing the regular working relationships, exchanges, and communications with other governments who are equally interested in atrocity prevention to ensure that we are identifying potential collective actions far upstream. But it remains a significant work in progress.
Just, if I may, a very small advertisement on the question of atrocity prevention tools. The Simon Scott Center developed a resource called Tools for Atrocity Prevention. You can find on our website, which tries to just lay out 23 separate types of atrocity prevention tools and then collect information about what they are, how they work, what the research says about them. We'll continue to try to refine and expand that in partnership with others. I wanted to ask about, we've been talking about the value of the law, the value of the strategy. There are also laws and strategies on what you might call adjacent topics on global fragility, women, peace, and security. I noted in the report to Congress, it talks about the prioritizing integration of the implementation of the Elie Wiesel Act alongside these others. If you can talk a little bit about what that means in practice, what that looks like, especially thinking of our colleagues in field missions and embassies, where this can seem like a blur of Washington priorities that are hard to distinguish from another.
Yes, it does seem like we're always.
Can I add on to that?
Mhm.
And how do we make prevention not a second priority order, but actually a first priority order? As Megan always says, we have this incredible canon of law, prevention canon of law that we've all advocated so strongly for. So how do we do that?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, no, I mean, that's what we're trying to do through priority prevention country initiatives that I mentioned earlier and things like that. But it is just such an ongoing challenge because, as David and others have said, bandwidth is limited, and we're just much better at responding to ongoing crises because those, of course, are the most pressing demands on our time, right? But I would say over the last year, we have been able to continue those priority prevention efforts, even while responding to crises in Ukraine and Sudan and Ethiopia and elsewhere. It's a balancing act, and we struggle with it, as David said. But we can, going forward, I think the emphasis on shifting toward prevention will only increase. And that'll continue to be a priority for us and across the interagency, and we'll continue to look for ways to better do that. I mean, I don't have a perfect answer right now, but we have seen, even in the last year, a shift to putting more emphasis on that over response.
I guess from a USAID perspective, we do have the wind at our back a little bit on this. All of these issues, WPS, GFA, and AP, I mean, a lot of them look at the same dynamics, the same factors, the same dysfunctionalities within the society. And so for us, I mean, all roads lead to these same issues. And so we have the luxury in this space of not just responding, but also looking at the upstream issues as well. And so just a couple specific examples. And so it's easier to kind of tweak the way we do business to kind of make sure you do have this intentional integration that GFA calls for. So as an example, when we do the GFA country analyses, the AP experts are looking at this and trying to understand where AP fits within this within the broader analyses. And also we're looking at in the MEL work that we're doing for GFA, we're also bringing in the atrocity prevention MEL work and indicators, and have stuff that is tracking that in the 10-year span that we have for GFA. So those are a couple of specific examples. And because, as I mentioned, we're all these paths lead to the same type of dynamic, it's easier for us when we're looking at upstream issues to make those tweaks.
Great. I think we're ready to turn to questions, both from those in the room and those online. Just introduce yourself quickly and just make sure your microphone's on. Thanks.
Sure. My name is Katie Smith. I'm with Search for Common Ground. I just had two questions for you. You talked a lot. First of all, thank you. I appreciate you being so candid about this. But the first question I had was, you talked a lot about kind of the improvements and adaptations you've made in process and learning in the interagency. I'm curious to what extent you see that same process of learning and sharing across like different country contexts. And so, for instance, like the response to Sudan, was that informed by what happened in Myanmar, what happened in Ethiopia? How is that kind of information sharing happening? And then my second question, really super excited for the emphasis on prevention. It's something our community is really, as Liz pointed out, want to make a first order priority. I'm curious if you're setting kind of goals for what these prevention efforts leave behind in these priority countries, right? Like, are we setting ourselves, I say this because Search just released a report this summer that talked about some of these, what works in terms of reducing the risk environment for atrocities. And we see like groups and structures that have capacities to identify and anticipate and respond to conflicts, increasing social cohesion or reducing polarization. Like, are there these kind of goals that are being kind of permeated across the interagency in terms of like, we can't necessarily, it's not always easy to say we prevented an atrocity, but we know that we reduce polarization. We know that we improve social cohesion. We know we built these structures and capacities. Is that something that is happening too? Thank you.
Who wants to take that to start?
I'll just take a stab at both of those questions. The first thing I'd say is, in terms of the sharing of lessons learned between countries, I mean, we do have the advantage here of having, at least in AID, I'll talk from the AID perspective, of having a team that works on all of these issues. It's a specialized team. And so easily what's happening in one country can move to another country. And so I think that's the way we're built organizationally. And I think that really helps that sharing process. As far as, the goals and what does this lead to in the indicators, I mean, that's part and parcel of the work we do. I mean, you've mentioned social cohesion, polarization. I mean, those are typically part of a USAID portfolio in terms of the MEL work and the indicators that we're looking at. I'm throwing justice as well. We do have very concrete indicators of, investigations, indictments, and things like that along those lines, as well as, surveying that deals with social cohesion, polarization issues that are collected, longitudinally. I think we look at some of the barometers, we can look at those issues as well. So that's part and parcel of a typical USAID program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, as we were conducting these atrocity risk assessments in priority countries, priority prevention countries, we saw in the end, in reports produced and the recommendations identified some similarities. I mean, the toolkits, the tools that we seek to apply often are similar across countries. And we can see we learn from what we see in one country and consider whether it might work in another context, taking into account the local context. So I think you do see that kind of learning across countries. And our team too, working on these issues is relatively small. So they are looking across countries and can, on an individual basis, apply some of those lessons learned. So that's helpful, I think. And I would note maybe on the response side, I could give one example. We at the State Department are supporting a platform called the Conflict Observatory that for the last year and a half has provided independent documentation of war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine. And they produce reports that are publicly available. They collect data in a way that can be used, we hope, in prosecutions later of those who committed these atrocities. And we have been able in the last couple of months since fighting erupted again in Sudan to take that platform and apply it there. So, we've looked at using that platform in other contexts like Burma. Sometimes it's just a question of resources, but we have been able to expand things that we've seen to be working well to other country contexts.
I on the first part of your question, I think one of the lessons to take away, because I share what my colleagues have said, is it's incredibly important for institutions to have dedicated offices that serve as the repositories of accumulated knowledge that can be applied across comparative contexts for atrocity prevention. I mean, at the State Department and USAID, we have such dedicated offices. My office was established primarily to focus on criminal accountability mechanisms, but over time, we now focus on the whole holistic range of transitional justice mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And as they have noted, we, of course, sort of accumulate knowledge that we apply to different countries and situations. The US government, I think, has a comparative advantage in that aspect, that we do have these specialized offices and bureaus, and not every government does. And it's just incredibly important for institutions to have these dedicated places and offices that accumulate that knowledge.
Sorry, just quickly jump in. Just so from the chat for our virtual attendees, we did have a question kind of early on, and we touched on this a bit, but what kinds of lessons learned analysis are you doing when prevention fails, right? So looking at the context in Sudan, for example, and how do those lessons learned become applied to future policy decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we do have, in EID, we have a culture of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This is something that we typically do. I'm trying to think off the top of my head about something that has failed that we've incorporated into our subsequent programming. Nothing comes to mind right now, but what I would say in terms of lessons learned is, we do have the example of Ukraine. I think the big lesson learned from Ukraine is long-term investment in counterparts and helping them build their networks, developing the capacity, does have a significant role to play in aspects of atrocity prevention. So for instance, we've had a justice project there since 2014. We've been working on human rights issues as well. And those counterparts were able to pivot really quickly and work with the Attorney General's office as it stood up its war crimes office and deal with documentation and compiling evidence and things like that. So, that's a positive lesson learned. But I guess the larger point is there are mechanisms, there are procedures by which we do this. I just can't think of a negative lesson, like a lesson learned of something we should not do again. I'm only thinking of the Ukraine example as what we want to replicate going forward.
Yeah, and just generally, we're much better at conducting monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL, at the program level than we are at this point at the more strategic level. We're trying to get better at that, looking across countries, across contexts. That's one of the things we're trying to do under the Global Fragility Act. We're trying to identify indicators that we can use to measure across all those priority countries and region to see if our collective efforts across those regions somehow did in fact prevent something. But that is a work in process. It's something that folks right now are developing, trying to identify those indicators that we could use across country context at a strategic level. So that's new, and it's something we're going to have to continue to work through in the months ahead.
Can I answer that for you guys?
Yeah, please. I mean, goodness, yeah.
What you guys did in Ukraine, and this were the lessons, I think, from Bosnia. From day one, you all funded work on atrocity crimes in Ukraine. Like that weekend, we were talking, you know, the Russians invaded. That weekend, we were talking with USAID about it. That is incredible. That was a big lesson learned from a failure from before. A lot of lessons we're pulling in now that it's not, you know, you have to work on destigmatization of these crimes, especially with men. You know, there's did that spur you guys a little bit on some of the lessons, you know, from,
Yeah.
Anyway, good job.
I mean, I can take
Some of the trends.
Ukraine
Yeah.
in part, and I agree with you. It's an example. So from the start of Russia's invasion last year, the US government focused on all of the possible accountability pathways and mechanisms. I mean, my office, working with others, we focused on accountability at the international level, very quickly offering support to the International Criminal Court and working to establish a commission of inquiry at the Human Rights Council, even activating sort of fact-finding missions that, to be honest, hadn't really been on everybody's menu before, such as the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE. And then very quickly, because GCJ had a pre-existing technical assistance program to the Office of the Prosecutor General on war crimes, using that entry point to scale up the scope of assistance, which Congress helpfully provided the additional resources for that. Identifying universal jurisdiction as a promising pathway that needed to be invested in early, and focusing on supporting documentation, especially thanks to USAID and their pre-existing programs supporting civil society groups. And then, of course, looking internally at the US legal framework to understand what lacuna existed and what gaps we needed to fill, which led to, within 8 months after Russia's invasion, the historic bipartisan congressional update to our War Crimes Act, giving our own prosecutors additional tools to bear on this. Now, there's more legislative work to be done, including, and I will just flag it for this grouping of community of practice, proposals to include crimes against humanity in US statutes, which does not currently exist and would be something bringing us into alignment with many of our partners and give us many tools that could be useful. But that didn't, to return to your point, that didn't sort of just arise from nowhere. We had the muscle memory across different agencies and bureaus to know which mechanisms to activate and how to do it quickly, right? The trick is replicating that in countries and contexts that perhaps are a little lower down on the global priority list than Ukraine became very immediately, right? But we have, over the years, I mean, if you look at all of those tools that were activated, for example, Syria, if we're going to take a critical look at our policy responses, all of those tools have now been activated, except for the ICC because of the threat of veto at the Security Council. But all of those tools have been essentially activated, but it took 5, 6, 7 years, right? Putting in place the documentation hubs and networks, building a sort of investigative mechanism at the international level that could serve as a clearinghouse to feed into universal jurisdiction efforts, identifying the other components of accountability, such as creating a new mechanism for the search for the missing and the disappeared. So we have accumulated these lessons about what kind of response to crises we can do. The question is how to swing into that. I would say back to the question that was relayed online, this is also another example of the tension between crisis response and atrocity prevention. When a society experiences a recurrence of violations and atrocities, we're not necessarily pulling together a lessons learned as to what we didn't do. The first response is, what can we do about these ongoing violations? Right. And then perhaps once the situation allows us a little more breathing room, then maybe we can do that sort of backward looking exercise. It should be ongoing and iterative, but in the sort of urgency of the moment, what we're focused on is civilian protection in the moment, humanitarian response, political messaging to the leaders to urge them to desist, finding political solutions to silence the guns, those sorts of crisis responses.
Well, I'm just gonna say, I don't think you guys are giving yourself enough credit, because the work that happened in Ukraine from the very beginning, you guys were funding real-time collection of data, looking at local actors on the ground, and, instead of just going directly to international. So look, I know everything isn't perfect, but I also want to call you guys out for lessons that were learned, and the work that you've all been doing. So.
If I could just maybe throw one in just on top, and then we'll take additional. How do you respond to the critique? I'm sure you've heard that, wow, on Ukraine, the US goes all in, huge amount of high level attention, huge amount of investment of various tools. And then on other situations, the response seems to be tepid. And how do you respond to the idea that, or the critique that, this is double standards, that US is committed to responding to atrocities when it's convenient, when it serves its other interests? What is the answer to that?
Well, we're continuing to respond to atrocities, and we're investing quite a lot of resources in responding to the atrocities in Sudan. And we were hugely invested, even while the Ukraine crisis was going on, in bringing to an end the conflict in northern Ethiopia. We managed to do that. We were instrumental in bringing the sides together and coming to agreement on a cessation of hostilities. And we're still very much involved in Ethiopia in terms of humanitarian access, transitional justice mechanisms, promoting support for human rights, and working to make sure that cessation of hostilities agreement is in fact implemented and doesn't fall apart while we're working in Sudan and all these other areas. So we continue to invest in conflict areas, in resolving conflicts around the world. Go ahead, David.
I mean, I think we have a good response, which is that, which is we do have a global focus, and we do care about accountability and atrocity prevention around the world. And we have a track record of trying to work on it. But on the other hand, I think we also have to take those accusations or the perception of selectivity and bias seriously and examine what's underlying those, such that we can improve our own and our collective response. I do think there's more that we can learn about sort of how to collectivize responses to the more forgotten atrocity situations. And I think, there is certainly more to be done to make this a truly global effort. If we're talking about universal jurisdiction, for example, as one pathway to justice, it has primarily been European states that have been the primary, activators of this phenomenon, with the US using our laws as we can. But that norm is starting to be diffused. Argentina bringing cases involving violations against Rohingya, et cetera. There are ways in which this needs to be a more global effort. And I think we have to be a little bit humble and a little bit honest in the face of that accusation, and use it to reflect on how we can improve, to be honest. And also redouble efforts to focus on other places other than Ukraine. I think the US is in a very good position, to sort of a very defensible position, to say, no, we have been working on Burundi, Guatemala, all these other places. And let's all, rather than say lack of justice or atrocity prevention response in one area means it's a sort of flawed project, say, no, the answer is more justice, more atrocity prevention response everywhere.
Okay.
And sort of turn it into a challenge almost to the critics to say, well, how can we invest more in focusing on those underappreciated areas or countries?
Let's take,
If I could just
Yeah,
add one
please.
point on here really
Yeah.
quickly. I mean, taking this as a starting point, David's point about humility. Yes, we need to definitely understand and listen and address those other perspectives, but also just a moment just to highlight as well. USG through USAID does have missions in 80 countries. We do work in 100 countries. I mean, it is perhaps that a few countries grab most of the attention of the media right now, but there is a lot of work happening that directly relates to prevention activities in all of these other countries as well.
great.
Sure, and we have even more emphasis out there.
And we're getting short on time. Let's take these two questions.
Sure. I'm Felicity Gray from Nonviolent Peace Force. We're a civilian protection NGO. I want to push back maybe a little bit on this conversation around Ukraine, but it's perhaps instructive in a sense that I think we have this atrocity prevention and response conversation at this policy level. And then when it comes to the USAID and state programs that are being supported and implemented, as someone that was heavily involved in program implementation in Ukraine last year, we were still experiencing a lot of resistance to integrating conflict sensitivity and peace building principles into the urgent humanitarian response, and a misunderstanding about the order in which those things need to happen, knowing that there's still work we can be doing now to set Ukraine up for success later down the line. So I'm wondering how you think through that conundrum, how we integrate as atrocities are occurring, these same prevention principles. And then my key question is around localization, which Colleen mentioned. Again, we have these conversations at a state or a policy level, and we often imagine atrocity prevention to be something that is embodied by states or state actors. How are we integrating communities themselves, who are often the first responders to atrocity risk and atrocities occurring? How are we integrating them as protection and prevention actors themselves into the way that the US understands atrocity prevention?
Can you pass your mic back to the?
Hi, I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a political psychologist, and I'm the U.S. convener of Transcend International. And if you're familiar with the work of Johan Galtung, but I'm close with him and visiting him in Spain next month. And also I've been affiliated with the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So anyway, you mentioned that you've used sanctions and visa restrictions, which seem like coercive techniques, and there's a lot of literature. I mean, sanctions work in very specific, limited cases, and often they have the opposite effect. And also, I'm curious about your reconciliation process, and I also co-authored a book with Johan on reconciliation. And I'm wondering if I'm working on raising consciousness about the Transcend method, which is analyzing the underlying conflict, looking at basic human needs, what are legitimate goals of the parties, and how to bridge legitimate goals and just grievances, which are sort of more in the order of second order change of dealing with the system and relationships, rather than first order change, which is dealing with the symptoms. So do you do any of that?
Great. Any comments on either of these sets of questions?
I mean, on the last point on where sanctions and visa restrictions are concerned, and of course there are different views about how effective they are in various contexts. We see more success in some cases than in others, but I've personally, over the last many years working for the State Department, have seen some successes, and these are just two of many tools that we can apply and try to apply. So I think it's important to remember that there are other things we're doing in every case, even as we're looking at sanctions and visa restrictions. And sometimes, those are the things that might make the news, whereas other activities might not be as public.
Sure, I can make an effort at responding to the humanitarian assistance question, localization. I mean, the answer to both is it's a work in progress. I mean, I think it's a perennial challenge that we have in having our humanitarian assistance incorporate that conflict sensitivity lens. It's understood it's a challenge. I mean, we are taking deliberate action to try to address it, but it is something that we are hoping to get to a better place in that space. As far as localization goes, this is definitely a major priority of the administrator. And just to throw some numbers out, I mean, I think the number that grabs most attention, I think it's 30% of our funding is supposed to be for local organizations within the next, I think it's the next few years. But the more important issue is the 50% of all of our programs must incorporate the local voice in a significant way. I mean, I can't talk to you about details about what that means in the context of protection and prevention in Ukraine right now. I don't have that granularity of information, but we are on a trajectory to make sure that there is a greater space for that local voice to be incorporated in what we do on a day-to-day basis.
I think pretty early on in the Ukraine conflict, we started working very closely with local organizations on a range of issues, including humanitarian response and efforts to document atrocities. And we set up very early on a Ukraine Rapid Response Fund that has channeled funding through organizations interested in ensuring that individuals with disabilities in Ukraine knew how to take cover in the event of an attack. So, you know, we historically have worked with local organizations. I don't think that's new, right? This is, USAID and state. We typically work with local partners when we implement programs overseas. I think in the last couple of years we started talking about it maybe more publicly, but we've placed an even greater emphasis on working with local partners. But that has been an ongoing component of our efforts overseas.
And I really appreciate that view from the ground, right? Because obviously it's always a challenge, and it's never going to be perfect. And there are inherent difficulties because there are tensions between some of the humanitarian activities and the more atrocity prevention focused activities. In the Ukraine context, to return to the discussion earlier about how we learn comparatively across situations. I mean, one thing early on from an accountability perspective was trying to use the lessons developed by wonderful groups like Physicians for Human Rights, for example, about training medical professionals who might be the sort of first point of contact for survivors of sexual violence or torture or other forms of violence, how to train those medical professionals on how to ethically intake that information in ways that protected the victims, but also allowed that to be useful for future accountability purposes. And that's a lesson that migrated from Central African Republic and the Congo, developed on the ground over many years, that we were able to sort of say, no, there is a way to navigate this tension. And people have developed principles and approaches and protocols. Obviously, they need to be adapted, but let's adapt them. And so we were early on able to do that. But certainly appreciate that gaps remain. There will always be these sorts of tensions. And I think part of the answer needs to be, how do we learn about them in real time? Because the distance between Washington and what happens, on the ground in some remote area carried out by an implementer of a humanitarian project, that distance can take a little time to travel. And so it becomes a little harder. There's a lag time there to fix it.
Well, I think I failed to keep us to our time, so apologies for that, but I think it's a useful few extra minutes of discussion. Let me thank our speakers, Colleen, Don, and David, for your comments, for your candor, and thank AFP for hosting, of course. Just a couple of very quick final comments. I think, to me, this conversation speaks to the value of the public report that you produce every year to Congress. It's to Congress, but it's also to this community, which was so instrumental in getting the Elie Wiesel Act passed in the first place. And coming here and being in real conversation about it, I think adds so much more value, because you can hear the questions and comments. You can speak more than you could speak in this specific report that we know gets massaged heavily through the interagency process. So I hope that you'll continue the conversation with those of us in this room and online and keep doing this year on year. And last but not least, want to make sure we acknowledge that the folks on your teams who are working these issues all day, every day, often with lots of difficulty, and we appreciate all of their hard work and commitment as well. So with that, I think I'll just bring us to a close. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.